Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Luisa Białasiewicz, and I am Professor of European Governance at the University of Amsterdam, and also the Academic Co-Director of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. We're very happy to welcome you today, and that you could join us for this lunchtime seminar on a topic that is of, and I don't think I'm exaggerating here, of great political urgency for Europe right now. So as you will all be aware, the European Council taking place later this week should decide, among many other pressing matters, should decide on final approval of the ambitious Pandemic Recovery Fund, the fund that was so painfully negotiated over the summer. And as momentous as those negotiations may have been, and I hope in the discussion today we will think about that, whether indeed, this is one of those momentous, Hamiltonian moments for Europe, or indeed if it should be, but we will set that aside for the discussion. Those negotiations and then the discussions that followed left many Europeans with a sense, with an impression that while, yes, member states were coming together in this moment of crisis, they were coming together in the face of the threat posed by the pandemic and its effects, its profoundly unequal effects, profound differences remained. And most importantly, differences with regards to what EU-wide solidarity should mean, could mean, and the extent to which such solidarity should be extended. So in these discussions, as I assume you're all aware, the divide between the so-called Frugal Four, and a moniker that was indeed also self-ascribed and self-selected. So the divide between this Frugal Four and the states in Europe's south most directly and strongly affected by the pandemic, like Italy and Spain. This divide was, I think we can say greatly over-exaggerated, strongly stereotypified, both by the media, but also by politicians themselves. And some of you will have attended a previous seminar we held on this topic, looking specifically at the kind of media representations of the two most kind of visible actors in this play of parts. So the Netherlands and Italy. And for those of you who are interested, you can access this previous event. It was called The Clash of Stereotypes on our center's website. Nevertheless, so stereotypes aside, many aspects of that political and indeed geopolitical representation stuck, right? They were taken on not just by the leaders, and this is interesting, not just by the leaders of the frugal states, like Rutte in the Netherlands, but equally by those at the receiving end of the frugals' objections. And if I think about the discussions taking place in this very moment in Italy about kind of how the Italian state and its capacity or incapacity to create a proper governance instrument for the money of the recovery fund, or even kind of attitudes towards the reform of the ESM. I mean, this is a very important sticking point right now. Those discussions are profoundly influenced by these representations. So these representations matter a great deal. What we would like to do in today's seminar is not just to question the political effects and utility of these representations, but actually to highlight, how accurate they are. To what degree do they actually reflect public attitudes, citizens' attitudes regarding economic risk sharing and willingness, indeed, to create EU-wide pandemic response mechanisms. So we are very fortunate to have with us today two colleagues who will share with us the results of two recent cross-national surveys on the potential for cross-national risk sharing and cross-national solidarity. Studies that show, in fact, that not only there is a much more nuanced picture and much more nuanced view of what Europeans actually believed to be the right measure of solidarity and how it should be made into policy. But also, and to me this is equally important, these studies very much point to the possibility of other policy solutions than the ones we are currently imagining. And I think this is very, very important, because I think, you know, these stereotypified representations of both Europe's North and its South in the discussions on the Recovery Fund have really trapped us into, you know, what we are imagining as the, you know, possible policy responses and solutions. So let me introduce the two panelists for today and also our discussant, and I will then tell you a little bit about how we hope to structure the discussion today. So our first panelist, Susie Dennison, is Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and she's the director of the ECFR's European Power Programme. Her work focuses very strongly on European foreign policy, security questions, but today she will present to us the findings of one of their most recent studies with this wonderful title of, you know, kind of the transformative 5 versus the frugal 4, kind of getting us to rethink how, you know, we envision, indeed, not just the not just the frugal 4 as the transformative 5, but how we think of European attitudes towards questions of economic solidarity. Our second speaker is Teresa Kuhn, a colleague from ACES and associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And Teresa will be sharing with us the results also of survey research that she has conducted together with colleagues this past summer. So actually right in the lead up to the discussions of the Recovery Fund at the previous European Council Summit. Studies that show also very much a much more complicated series of attitudes that have a lot to do with how solidarity is envisioned, how risk sharing is envisioned, and what sort of also governance mechanisms are in place for economic risk sharing. Finally, we're very fortunate to have with us a discussant who was willing to take these two studies on and ask some critical questions. Cas van der Horst is strategic advisor for the Directorate of European Affairs at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as I said, he has very graciously accepted the task of helping us take these studies to task, thinking what they mean, not just, of course, for the Netherlands, but what they can mean for different policy solutions for the EU in the coming months and years. So what we will do is now give the floor first to Susie and then to Teresa for about 8 to 10 minutes, so you can take us through the main findings of your research. I will then pass the floor to you, Cas, for a reaction and some questions. After you have done that, I will give the floor back briefly to Susie and to Teresa for reactions, and then we will open up the floor to everyone else for questions, comments. Now, the way you will be able to do that, you should be able to see a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You are very welcome to write your questions there. You can also, if you prefer, use the chat functions, and we will then take the questions. Please note, if you want to direct your question to a particular panelist, to both, to all three, so that is always very helpful. So I will stop here and I will pass the floor to Susie, and looking forward to hearing your
Well, thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to talk here today, and to the ACES for this really timely discussion. I will try and be as brief as I can, but I'm afraid as our project is data-based, I will share a few slides, which I promise not to bore you with, but I think it's helpful to kind of see the sort of the graphics that back up the arguments that we're trying to make with our work on the frugals. So hopefully you can now see the slides, and perhaps not me, but I'm still here. You can hopefully hear me. So basically, yes, at ECFR, as Louisa said in her introduction, in October this year, we decided that we wanted to understand, after the recovery fund had been sort of preliminarily agreed, given where we are now at the Council and the European Parliament, we wanted to look at what impact that decision had had on attitudes to Europe in some of the key states around decision making. So we carried out a public opinion poll. We commissioned Dynato and Data Praxis to do this for us in the 4 frugal states plus Finland, which kind of belatedly joined the group during the negotiations over the summer. And then for comparison, we also looked at Germany and France as 2 of the key actors in sort of brokering the compromise over the recovery fund, and Poland, which is set to be one of the biggest beneficiary states from the next budget. And we had a sample size of 1,000 people in each country in order to have a big enough picture. And just very briefly to kind of tell you the key conclusions that I'm going to run through with you today. But the first kind of strong takeaway for us was that if the idea of frugality is about spending less, then in fact, Austria, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands and Sweden are not as frugal as, for example, Germany, when we asked a question about their key takeaways from the recovery fund and whether or not that indicated that the EU was spending too much money. And this was the case for almost 8 in 10 voters in these countries, that this wasn't one of their kind of key conclusions from the recovery fund. However, they are concerned about not how much the money the EU is spending, but rather the way it's spent. And there seems to be major worry about the risk of financial waste and corruption in the way that the money is used. And one of the other sort of key conclusions that we had was that one of the bigger issues is the extent to which these countries feel that they are able to influence the direction of the EU, the decision-making process and so on. And it is rather that that's kind of driving a feeling about whether or not they kind of belong within the European project, rather than a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the recovery fund deal over the summer. So very quickly, to look at those points in more detail, frugality or not. Here you can see the figures, those for each country who did feel that the recovery fund, the recovery package showed that the EU was spending too much money. And you can see that the highest answer is indeed in Germany, rather than the frugal states, where they kind of, they're somewhere between 20 and 25% for all of them. But the answers on the kind of the key takeaway being about the risk of financial waste and corruption are much higher. You can see here the kind of the biggest concern around this issue is in Austria, but you know, fairly strong pluralities in all of the frugal states came through on this point. Interestingly, here there isn't very much difference between the frugal states and the other countries that we looked at, which does indicate that this is an issue, a kind of a whole of EU issue, rather than it just being a problem for the frugal states. Sort of for completeness, I'm showing you now the other, the next kind of highest answers that came through overall in terms of other statements that people believe to be correct about the recovery package. And we can see in there a desire for the expenditure of this money to be used to set common standards for economic recovery, the importance of developing resilient healthcare systems for the next crisis, the climate issue being in there, making sure that this recovery package contributes also to
I think we lost Susie. Let's see if we can reclaim her somehow. Just 1 second, and let's see if we can. Susie, we lost you. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Sorry. Have you
disappeared.
Can you hear me again now?
You have returned, but your slides have not.
Oh, okay. Well, then very quickly, the point that I was trying to make about the party breakdown in the Netherlands is that on this issue of the risk of corruption and waste, what's quite striking is this is how high it features for all political groups. And it's only the PVV which puts the issue of total EU expenditure higher. Can you see my screen again now, just to be clear? Yes, great. Okay. Very quickly, just to show as well this idea about kind of feelings about the EU after the recovery feel. The states that we covered are fairly even between a kind of negative feelings and positive feelings. In this pie chart, the blue feelings are the positive ones, the red ones are things like anger, frustration, and worry. And you can see that it's a fairly even split between the two sides. And that also holds for when you look at individual country breakdowns, sort of roughly everywhere. You know, the balances are slightly different, but roughly everywhere people are fairly sort of evenly split, apart from in Poland, where the sense of optimism, relief, and enthusiasm kind of does quite clearly outweigh the negative emotions about the recovery package. Now, the final kind of takeaway that I wanted to emphasize to you is this sense of declining influence. When we asked the question about whether or not they thought their country's influence had grown or shrunk over the last 2 to 3 years, there was this relatively strong sense of decreasing influence among the Frugal Five. You can see 42% when you look at the states, the Frugal Five states as a group. And the only country in which you got a sort of a stronger answer for increased influence as opposed to decreased influence was Germany overall. So again, I think that this is a whole of EU issue, but which seems to be kind of playing quite strongly in public opinion in the frugal states at the moment. There could be a sort of a Brexit dimension to this, where they've lost a kind of a like-minded state with the UK leaving. I'm not suggesting that this is only about the recovery package, but what I am suggesting is that we should perhaps see this agreement around the recovery fund sort of through that prism. Just to come very quickly onto kind of where that leaves these states in terms of their relationship with the EU. You know, in terms of the sort of the takeaways that we tried to address in the report, the messages kind of for the national governments primarily of these countries are firstly that we need to deal with this influence point. Citizens need to feel that they do have an influence on the decision-making process and that this produces results that are in their national interest. So I think kind of focusing on that messaging, picking the right battles, and it seems like, you know, maybe the right battles at the moment might be around this issue of financial waste and corruption. The kind of the rule of law question seems to be there in terms of citizens' concerns as well, and making sure that they kind of they get the outcomes that are good for their country in the EU context is an important part of it. I think secondly, though, it's about sort of how you package those results when you come back home after negotiating in Brussels. And here I think there's a big lesson to learn from the British experience, which was, you know, decades of just blaming Brussels for everything that was bad that we had to swallow at home in the UK and never giving it credit for anything that was good. And I think that is something which, you know, there's a salutary lesson in there, given the state of public opinion in the frugal states at the moment. But thirdly, and I'll finish on this point, I think it's also important to see, we asked a question about the EU's added value in the different countries that we covered. And it's clear that although there is a kind of a core of support for the EU as an economic project which centres around the single market, the EU's added value goes much more broadly than that in the way that voters thinking. And interestingly, there is even a kind of growing strength of opinion about the added value on security, terrorism, and justice cooperation, which, you know, in states like Denmark is quite surprising given opt-outs and so on. So I think that sort of building up that story about how the single market and these broader EU value adds come together will be an important part of the narrative in those countries. I'll leave it there because I'm keen to hear from others, but I'm very happy to answer any questions in the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Susie, and thanks for being very concise in your presentation. And indeed, I'm sure we will come back to a lot of these points, because I think, the broader question, that you're pointing to, that this is not only merely about the discussions of the Recovery Fund, or even not merely about, the right sort of economic risk sharing, but rather about these countries' role in the EU and in envisioning what a future European project can be. I mean, I think this is very relevant. But I'd like to give the floor now to my colleague, Teresa Kuhn, so she can share some of the findings of the research that she and her collaborators carried out this summer, since it also points us to a quite different direction, let's say, than some of the media representations of willingness for risk sharing and for European solidarity. So Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me first just share my screen. I hope. Are you able to see my slides? Yes, good. So yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present our research here. It's really great to have this panel here with somebody else who just also recently did a study on the Recovery Fund, and then actually also get somebody to reflect on this from the policy perspective. So thanks a lot, especially for Louisa for organizing this. What I'm going to present today is a joint research project that I conducted together with Björn Bremer, Maurits Meyers, and Francesco Nicoli. We joined forces. We all share an interest in EU solidarity, public opinion, and the political economy side of European integration. And we conducted a survey experiment on support for the Recovery Fund, which was fielded in 2020, in July 2020. So, of course, questions of solidarity were really at the forefront in the European struggle to respond to the coronavirus crisis. And this crisis really reinforced historical differences between the North and the South. And I'm just showing you this, this Dutch weekly Elsevier, which had a front cover, which most of you probably have seen, which very much plays into the stereotypes of the Northern Europeans being extremely hardworking and Southern Europeans just leading the Dolce Vita, so to speak. Very interestingly, there was also a reply to this online on Twitter, where you could see somebody had changed the faces so that it was actually the hardworking Southern Europeans and some very sunburned and slightly overweight Northern Europeans having a good life in the South. So yeah, if you see this, then you think, wow, there's really not so much space for solidarity in the EU, and it seems to be a lot still about national interests, national stereotypes, us against them, or always in the interest of your own country. However, our study actually really nuances this picture. In this study, we tried to answer a couple of questions. So what actually drives support for solidarity and risk sharing? And here especially, which aspects of the policy itself drive support? So how should, in a way, a policy package dealing with an economic recovery for the COVID-19 crisis, how should it actually look so that people accept it? And another important question here is how is this support structured within and across countries? Well, actually, there is already quite some literature on solidarity in the European Union, which emerged as a response to the euro crisis. And also this literature is probably much more positive or optimistic and nuanced than what you would expect. It is true that there's generally less strong solidarity in the EU than national solidarity, but it does exist. People are especially able to be convinced about solidarity. So you can actually design policies that, for example, have clear conditions for coverage. And by doing so, you can actually convince or kind of buy people over to support it. There's also some emerging literature on solidarity in the coronavirus crisis, mainly on Germany. Here we have seen that Germans strongly support medical solidarity, but are much less interested in financial solidarity. Another study has actually found just on 2 countries similar results in a way than what Susie was just presenting, that there is some kind of room of agreement between Italians and Germans. So also this existing literature already highlights that the picture is maybe less dark than one would expect. We conducted this survey in July 2020 in 5 countries: France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Spain. We chose these countries because, the Netherlands is Frugal Four, and France, Spain, and Italy are on the receiving side, or especially Italy and Spain, excuse me, are mostly on the receiving side, and Spain, sorry, France is somewhere in between. We drew a random sample of 1,500 respondents per country. And to make sure that it's actually representative, we used quotas for age, gender, education, and regional distribution. So it's not only a certain type of people who answered our questions, but really a cross-section of society. And we presented these people with policy options and alternatives on how such a joint answer to the coronavirus could actually look like. And these options, they varied on 6 policy dimensions. So you might now ask, what is a conjoint experiment? It is a survey-based experiment to estimate the impact of policy designs on preferences for multidimensional issues. It has a big advantage to other survey research in a way that we can really zoom in on different alternatives and really look, okay, it's not so much a question of do we want such a recovery fund, yes or no, but what kind of recovery fund do we actually want? And what is also really interesting for us here is to see, okay, under which conditions, how should we design such a fund that we can actually even win over the most critical and most skeptical people in society. So here I'm showing you the dimensions that we were varying in our experiment. So first of all, the purpose of such a recovery fund. Should it only focus on healthcare, or also look at the economy, or also climate change measures? How should it be financed? Should it just be taken from existing money, or should the EU actually borrow additional money? How should it be repaid? Either all countries repay exactly what they receive, so in a form of a loan, or otherwise all countries repay together. Distribution could either be pro rata, so every country receives the same per inhabitant, or those countries that are hit harder receive more. Should this fund actually be terminated once this crisis is over, or is the program maintained also for future crises? And finally, who actually takes the decision? The European Commission, the finance ministers of the member states all together, or each finance minister individually. So here I'm giving you an example of how it actually looks for a respondent. So first they received some information on, you know, the need or the want of such a joint program. And in the next step, they were then confronted here, for example, with option 1, option 2, with 2 different options that vary on the dimensions that I was just relating to. And in the next step, they can then choose which ones of the 2 options they prefer and how much they actually rate each of them. This was repeated 3 times. So altogether, each respondent rated 6 different policy options, which led to 45,000 observations. So you might now think, wow, this is actually pretty complex for respondents. Are they actually able to do something like this? Well, we've done a couple of different robustness checks to actually make sure that they're not only just, you know, clicking through. So for example, people who were clicking through were weeded out by the survey itself. So there were also some tricky questions in the back where we could see, okay, people really didn't read. But we also compared how, for example, the answer to this and this question would actually, you know, are they consistent? Do results hold if we take them out, etc. So we are actually pretty confident that people understood what they were confronted with, especially because we actually see quite some strong effects of how this policy could be designed. So what you see here is on this side, you see basically just the different policy, the options for each dimension. So for example, whether it should be healthcare and climate change, healthcare and economy, or healthcare only. And here you see how this impacts public support. What you can see is if it's more to its, from my side now, the right side, support is higher. If it's on this side, then support is lower. We can here see very well that people are sensitive to, for example, the purpose of such a policy, and they prefer a policy that does not only focus on healthcare, but especially on healthcare and the economy. So focusing also on the economy in general increases support for such a recovery fund. In contrast, we see that borrowing on the markets is highly seen as problematic. People are skeptical about this. And this finding is also robust across a lot of different sub-analyses that we did. So people of all different countries and groups of society actually agree on this. To summarize here, we can see that citizens prefer a scheme that focuses on healthcare and the economy, that draws on existing resources rather than on borrowing, that relies on loans rather than grants, a program that is needs-based in its distribution, has a long-term duration, and intergovernmental decision-making. So these are the overall findings. Of course, one of our most interesting questions here is how is this distributed across countries? So how does it differ across country? And our expectation was that we will find cross-country differences that are reflecting national interests. And we thought so, especially because we ran the survey in July, so really just after months of heated debates on this issue. So we thought, okay, people are so cued by their national media, by their national governments on their self-interest, on national interest, they will show very clear differences here. So we expected that in Italy, Spain, and to a lesser extent also in France, there would be higher support for packages with a wider scope that has debt-based financing, joint repayment, is distributed based on needs, and has also long-term duration. Whereas we would expect that for Germany and the Netherlands, support is lower on these issues. So what do we find? Well, we actually do find some results in line with self-interest. The most notable one here is the loans versus grants issue. So whether money should be paid back individually or jointly. And here we see that Italy and Spain are significantly in favor of joint repayment, whereas the three other countries, and most notably the Netherlands, are clearly against joint repayment. So this is in line with self-interest. We also see that even though all countries support, or all populations of these 5 countries support need-based distribution, this finding is strongest in Italy and in Spain, and less so in the other countries. And finally, something that surprised us is that actually with respect to borrowing, all 5 countries really agree. So in populations of all 5 countries are clearly against borrowing and in favor of using existing economic resources. We also looked at individual differences. I'm not going to go through all the slides for time reasons, but also here we saw that in general, there is strong agreement on the policy design. So it's not that people really have enormously different opinions. We do see that pro-Europeans are most supportive of grants. They also prefer a needs-based distribution more than Eurosceptics, for example, and they are more or less the only ones who are in favor of supranational governance, i.e. that the Commission actually takes decisions. Left-wing voters are also more in favor of grants. They're also the ones that are most open to climate change mitigation measures. But again, otherwise, there is quite some agreement on these policy dimensions. One interesting question is like, okay, how does public support look for the next generation EU package? And here we compare it to basically the least liked and the most liked packages here. So we ran different models. The conservative estimate basically means that we rated even people who gave a neutral opinion on a package as negative. And in the green one, we actually took those people out. And what we see is that the least liked package receives support of around 33% of the population, whereas the most liked package clearly receives majority support. And the next generation EU package, yes, it depends on exactly how you measure it. If we take this conservative estimate, then we see that public support at that time was below 50%. But it was very interesting to see that if we actually change one of the dimensions and actually make it permanent, then public support increases to around 50%. So here we see that even though support for the current package is not really overwhelming, with a little bit of tweaking, so to speak, you could clearly make it, design it in a way that it receives majority support. This brings me to my conclusion. So we do see some support for risk sharing in this crisis, and especially for this recovery fund. The overall expectation that there are huge country differences and that left-right orientations and EU support really matter, we could not find them. They're actually less pronounced than one would expect. And in general, we were surprised by the strong agreement across societies and within societies on certain dimensions, which makes us conclude that there are clearly spaces for compromise between and with countries for such a package. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Teresa. And it's really interesting, to think about how both your and your colleagues' research and the research conducted, Susie, that you did with the ECFR, are drawing out some very similar conclusions, certainly a much more nuanced picture regarding both cross-country variation, which is not as extreme as we would expect, but also that there is agreement on various possible approaches. And as I noted in the beginning, to me, what is very relevant about that is imagining other policy solutions. So there is that space. It's just, kind of thinking how to present these policy choices where, you know, as Teresa, you were saying, making it not just about the recovery fund, not just about pandemic, you know, crisis funding, but also about questions such as climate change, which is something that the ECFR report was pointing to very strongly as well. So, you know, kind of thinking more broadly. But I will set aside my comments for now, because I'd like to give the floor to Cas and hear what questions he has to our two panelists and on the studies that were just presented. Cas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Susie and Theresa for two very interesting presentations. I think this very much reflects what Louisa started kicking off in stating that the Frugal Five and the Southern states have made it into stereotypes. And she started with emphasizing that there are a lot more nuances. What struck me in the paper of Susie is that there is quite a lot of shared issues of, for instance, waste and corruption, but also national influence in the EU, which are more shared than divided amongst the countries. I think that in Theresa's research, the one slide where there was a clear correlation of the preferences amongst the member states, except for 1 point, perhaps 2 points, is also an indication that that the whole situation is a lot more nuanced than the stereotypes indicate. I think that what both papers very strongly supported, strongly indicated, is that there is a support for solidarity, especially in the context of the RRF and in the Corona context. My questions are more about the conclusions that you have drawn. And for Theresa, that's not so much in the presentation that you have given, but in the paper that I've read beforehand on Vox EU and CPR. Which I would like to refer to as well. In that conclusion, you write, the road from the euro crisis to the EU's first attempt at creating a fiscal capacity has been a long one. Importantly, we find that support for a joint European fiscal instrument is high, and that the RRF agreed on the Next Generation EU is a well-tailored instrument for the purpose, at least according to the citizens in the 5 country studies. While citizens are not enthusiastic about common debt, the issue is not important enough for citizens to negatively evaluate the program as a whole. In the beginning of that paper, you write, however, the political context of the pandemic, as well as the design of the RRF fund, will likely affect citizens' preferences for fiscal integration and risk sharing. That's also what you indicated in the presentation that you have. That statement that the pandemic, the political context of the pandemic indicates the design of the RRF also works in the other way round. The situation in which the RRF came into existence is also exceptional. And it's one against the background of the Corona pandemic. So I've got 2 questions. One, do you think that the present support for this type of instrument, the present support for fiscal capacity, the present support for Next Generation EU, will continue once the effects of the Corona pandemic start ebbing away? My second question goes a bit beyond that. Explicitly, the RRF was not set up as a joint fiscal capacity, but as a one-time crisis response. This, I think, is also supported by your most liked scenario, which indicates that what people prefer it aims at the existing resources. I read that as the EU budget, the existing EU budget. It wants that each country has to repay what it receives, as a must. And thirdly, it's permanent, but only to be used in crisis situations. If that's all the case, then making the RRF a stepping stone towards a full fiscal capacity by the EU would or could perhaps be perceived as a breach of agreement by many of the people that you have interviewed. What would be the support for that, therefore, in the long term? If that's really made a step, do you think that that support would continue? To Susie, I also have a quote from you from the conclusion. There is little doubt that voters in the frugal state regard the recovery package as far from ideal. But ECFR's surveys data indicate that they understand the need for compromise in an organization of 27 states and that the benefit of EU membership outweigh its costs. Indeed, their appreciation of the EU's contribution in some policy areas, and you indicated that before, from strengthening the single market and the rule of law to cooperation on security and terrorism to protecting their countries from war and conflict, suggests that they have an appetite for more Europe. More Europe, there you ended the quote, more Europe is generally seen as more competence to the Commission. Is that what you mean with this as well? I see you shaking, so it's a good question I asked. The reason why I want to know is that in the rest of the conclusion you write, I quote again, for political leaders in Austria, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands and Sweden, the frugal label is no longer tactically useful now that the recovery fund has been finalized. Public sentiment presents them with an opportunity to reposition themselves as an engine of EU transformation. The fact that the frugal label is no longer tactically useful follows from your findings, which you also presented at the beginning of your presentation, that I quote, almost 8 in 10 votes in the frugal states do not believe that the European Union is spending too much money on the COVID-19 recovery fund. This, however, may reflect that the support for a COVID crisis response is related to the COVID crisis response. And that's something, in my perception, different than declaring that a frugal label is no longer tactically useful. Being frugal and aiming at transforming the EU are not exclusive. And I think that many politicians in the Netherlands do not see it as exclusive. They can go hand in hand. If you look at it this way, that it's both being frugal and transforming the EU, voters' appetite would not be so much for more Europe, but for a different Europe. Have you investigated such a thing? And if so, what would be the outcome? Thanks.
Thank you very much for those difficult questions, Gus, but I think very relevant ones, because I think, the two things that you closed with, one is, are the findings of these two surveys unique to the pandemic moment? I mean, is this outpouring of solidarity or the willingness to extend solidarity beyond national borders the fruit of this particular moment of crisis? And I hate to use that term, but is it just spurred by that, or is it something that will, as you're saying, persist? And I think that's very relevant, because then it speaks also to the sort of policy initiatives and also the sort of European response. So what kind of, I guess I would rephrase what you said. It's not what kind of Europe, but what kind of more Europe we would be able to imagine. So I will let the two of you respond. Who would like to start first? Susie, would you like to start? Kind of, so we will go from from the end.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think they're very good and very fair questions. Maybe to sort of to take them in the order in which you put them. This idea of potentially there being space in some areas such as cooperation on security and terrorism for more Europe. No, I didn't mean, we didn't mean more competences to the Commission. And I think that the sort of the reason for that kind of comes from our broader work on public opinion, wherein you can see we did a larger survey across 9 member states immediately after the first wave of COVID, as that was starting to recede. And one of the questions that we asked there was around the extent to which their image of the European Commission had improved or worsened during the COVID crisis. And there were fairly consistent responses saying that it hadn't, that it had worsened, and perhaps more damningly, on a different this was very much about the kind of the handling of the health crisis, because it was in April rather than in the summer. But nevertheless, I think it's important. But on the other hand, when we asked a question about whether or not people thought the crisis had shown the need for more cooperation at a European level, you got strong responses. I think it was 63% across all the states that we surveyed, saying that they were in favour of more cooperation. So I think you get this idea of what I like to call, for shorthand, a kind of a Europe without institutions, this idea of intergovernmentalism. The support for Europe kind of delivering on the issues that they care about, but it definitely doesn't feel like the right time for a conversation about more integration, more institutions and so on. It feels like the time where Europe has to kind of deliver on you know, the files which impact on their daily lives. And that kind of brings me to the second question about the transformative states and you know, the extent to which this will last beyond the immediate COVID crisis. I mean, obviously we can't know from the research that we've done around this project, but I would draw attention to a question which we also asked in the post-COVID period, which was around whether or not the crisis had made them more or less supportive of climate action. And everywhere it had increased the kind of the desire to see more done on. So there's the sense that the COVID crisis hadn't replaced the kind of the previous thing that they were worried about. And you can see that as well when you ask about questions like immigration and so on. These things haven't gone away in people's minds, and there's still a kind of desire to sort of to see European action on these things. I think in some ways what we might expect is that there's more expectation that that European institutions will be more prepared for the next crisis after this experience. But I don't think that COVID is going to be the only driver, and the health crisis is going to be the only driver, although it will, I think, remain very, very much part of people's security perceptions now in a way that perhaps health wasn't previously. So yeah, those would be my kind of quick responses to your very good questions.
Thank you very much for that, Susie. Teresa.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cass, for your questions, and also for reading our article so thoroughly. That's very much appreciated. So your first question was whether we think that present support for fiscal capacity will actually continue. And here, I do think yes, first of all, because I think we have never, of course, done any studies previously on such recovery fund, because it was just not a question, it was not a table. But previous research on solidarity in the EU actually does show that people are supportive of helping each other. And I think what was also striking is that the dimension that people, or the aspect of this policy that people are most critical about, namely joint borrowing, is something that we see has also previously been met with lots of skepticism in public opinion surveys. So there are several different surveys on Eurobonds, and also there we could see that people were actually critical of Eurobonds already in 2012. So this seems to be consistent, and the other aspects, yeah, there also before COVID-19, there has been some support for it, and I think it will actually grow, especially because I think institutions like this one, they do open, in a way, yeah, new opportunities and make people more aware that this is actually also a possibility of how problems can be solved at the European level. So in the same way that, for example, right now, pensions and healthcare, etc., is all done at the national level, and because of the national institutions that exist, we actually are okay with paying taxes for, yeah, to support unemployed, etc. I think in the same way, this can also frame such a new institution, such a new policy can also frame our understanding of that we share at the European level. So I think it goes a bit in both ways. Also, something that I would still like to say here is that we do see in the media and in public discourse, mainly the people who are critical about it. Those get very, I mean, that there's of course a media logic about it, that it's very interesting to focus on these people. But the other thing is that even among the people who say, yes, I'm in favor, or I would support some kind of joint solution to this problem, these people are usually not very passionate or emotional about it, you know. They're even it's maybe even the same effect as we see when we ask, okay, who would volunteer to pay some extra money, you know, and you just ask it around, nobody will actually do that. But if you ask people one-on-one, then they will say, yeah, actually I could do that. So I think also here is some kind of dynamic going on, that the people who are skeptical about, for example, European solidarity are the ones who are most outspoken about it, who are the ones who really want to actually go on the streets for it. But the people who are in favor of it, there's not really anything that will tell them, oh, I really need to fight for this. And I think this explains the disbalance that we sometimes see in public discourse, and the underestimation of the people who actually are pro-solidarity. Yeah, the question about whether it is a one-time crisis response or whether it should be long-term. I mean, I agree that, so if I understand correctly, you say such a fund would then not only be a crisis response, but just would generally be there, and therefore people could feel kind of lied at that they actually first supported it. I think we, of course, didn't really say in what kind of situation or under which conditions it would be reused. We just said it's ready to be used in different crises, in future crises. So it has this crisis element to it. And there we do see that people prefer that over a one-time, one-shot fund. So I would be less worried about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you for this. And, you know, again, I'm struck by some of the continuities between these two studies. I mean, because, I mean, the way, you know, you were describing, you know, how people might be willing to think of these options differently has very much to do with the kind of narratives that are constructed about it. And one of the things that, you know, I really took away from your study, Susie, was this perceived gap between national and European interests that is not necessarily there in practice, but it's kind of reweaving the narrative, not, you know, to tell kind of false stories, you know, kind of nice stories we tell ourselves for the pandemic moment. So kind of to go to what you were saying, Cass, you know, kind of papering over differences, but, you know, kind of conveying the understanding that there are actually kind of continuities of economic interest, of, you know, interest, whether it's, you know, regarding climate change, healthcare. I mean, those are very much there. It's just that they are somehow very often lost. And again, not to paper over existing differences and in, you know, in approaches and in, you know, the willingness to share certain economic risks. I mean, one other important point I think that comes out from both of your responses is that we need to think of, you know, what is happening today as having a much longer legacy from the Euro crisis on, and, you know, perhaps even before. So I think, you know, we're reenacting some of the same stereotypes, but also, I mean, there are also political economies that have, you know, kind of divides in Europe that persist. And so, I mean, you know, we're not operating on a kind of blank slate, obviously. There are a number of questions, but I wanted to see, Cass, if you wanted to jump back in, if you had any points of clarification or anything else. You're satisfied with the responses. So we have a number of questions that are in the queue here, and some have already kind of been answered in the meantime. So there, Teresa, there are 2 points of kind of specification clarification to you. One regarding, you know, I mean, where people actually ask, you know, how realistic do you think these ideas are? I mean, is this just a thought experiment saying, oh no, if this were possible, then, because I think that's a very relevant point. I mean, if that was part of the discussion. And then a second one regarding the joint payment kind of mechanism, and, you know, how people were, you know, kind of told as part of the survey of how this could work. I mean, you know, these are not just kind of pie in the sky, you know, let's reimagine a different Europe. But were people presented with actual, you know, kind of workable policy solutions?
Yeah, so we did not ask a question on how realistic people thought that their preferred policy option would be. It would be, of course, very interesting to know that. But yeah, for time reasons, we did not include that. It's maybe interesting to know that in the information that we gave respondents before answering that particular question, we framed it in a way that we said, yeah, there are several options on the table. So it did not really sound like, okay, there's only one policy option and everything else is a thought experiment. So in that respect, we did not cue them in any way to think that one is more realistic than the others, but we of course don't know what they think. I think in general they were aware that it was very realistic that something like this would happen, because the survey was really done in July, actually just before and just after there was an agreement on the recovery fund. So because of that, I think it was very much in the minds of people. There was one question about what joint repayment actually means, and whether, yeah, this is actually under which conditions this would actually happen. We did not give any information on that. So we just, I mean, in the end, it is just a survey, so we cannot really give too much information. So we just said, how is the money repaid? Each country repays exactly what it receives, or all countries repay together, rich countries paying more and poor countries paying less. So here we just wanted to look at the possibility of having some kind of cross-country redistribution in the long term here. But yeah, again, it's a question how we cannot really say what people exactly made of it. Also because I think two people asked the question about what does existing resources mean. So here the question was, how is the program financed? And one answer is existing money is taken from European resources such as the EU budget. So we do link to the budget. And the other one is additional money is borrowed by the EU on the financial markets. And again, here we don't think that the particular wording of the question is decisive in the response pattern, because, as I said, we could see similar questions and similar responses in earlier surveys on Eurobonds. So there seems to be really some kind of dislike of joint borrowing on the markets. I think
which seems to be pretty consistent
exactly.
Across exactly different countries, but also the different studies that have been done. I wanted actually to, I see we have more questions, but I wanted to kind of go back to the kind of geopolitical component of all of this. So thinking both of what you were saying, Susie, but also some of the points that you made, Cass, because I think, as you pointed out in even, the brief overview that you gave us, Susie, the question, yes, is about the recovery fund. Yes, it's about, other potential economic instruments, but it is also about the role that these countries feel they are playing in shaping the direction of Europe, very broadly conceived. And, here, this is with a wink to you, Cass, so not necessarily more Europe and more powers for the Commission, but in what direction Europe should be going. And I think there is, I guess I would like to add another layer to this. So thinking, how with the results of these surveys, how we can, kind of think of that differently, but also thinking how these states, but also other EU states, can shape the way in which the EU will show itself to the world as responding to the pandemic, because I think that's equally important. I mean, whether, certainly confronting the EU response as problematic as it has been, and as problematic as it has been perceived by the respondents in the surveys. Still, if you compare it to some other contexts, it has done a much better job, whether now, kind of considering questions of, vaccination, access to vaccines, and all sorts of other things. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit more from you from the survey about, how, kind of geopolitical positioning, both externally, but also within Europe, can help maybe change the terms of this debate.
For me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm very happy to speak briefly on that. My answer will go beyond the kind of the Frugal survey, but I think it includes these states as well. And what you can really see from the COVID experience is this growing recognition of the importance of the European space for responding to various different crises. We're a foreign policy organisation, so the sort of power projection as a global actor is a very interesting part of that for us. And we kind of asked a number of questions in our what we call our post-COVID survey in April about what kind of actor Europe needed to be after this experience. And as I said, the climate question is quite prominent within that. So the kind of the European Green Deal and the response to that is clearly well formulated for the current political moment. But I think there's also this idea of the economic sovereignty dimension, which you can see as well. So when we asked how Europe should change after the COVID crisis, one of, I think it was at number 3 and 4 in terms of the responses on that, was this idea that we needed to be able to protect production of essential goods and services. And we asked that in 2 parts. One was around essential goods and services for healthcare, and one was other essential items and other critical goods. And so, this idea that the European level is the correct response to a world where we see increasing competition, continent-sized powers, and so on, was very clearly there, and strikingly was also very present in the responses when we did the survey in the UK. At the very same time as you're seeing the kind of the brinkmanship in the trade that talks about the future relationship between the EU and UK, you can see a sort of a real recognition of the need to be connected to Europe and the potential to have shorter supply chains and so on for the next time crisis hits. But the other dimension, which was perhaps biggest, was that you needed a Europe that could kind of stand together as a global actor. And so this was a kind of an answer about sort of dealing with future conflict, future crises, and so on, i.e. being a foreign policy power. So kind of support for this idea of a collective foreign policy. And so I think, you know, and this kind of comes back a little bit to Cass's point that although we're not seeing a kind of a strong kind of endorsement of something like this conference on the future of Europe that we're just sort of diving into in terms of reflecting on the how, you do get a very clear sense that there is support for the what Europe should be doing. The kind of the second biggest answer in how Europe should change that I haven't talked about so far, but is important too, is about more control of external European borders. That was very evident as well. And that's an issue that I would like to look into more over the coming months, because for me, that response shouldn't necessarily be taken as a kind of a comment about migration. I think it's more about kind of having the control that you need to deal with crises. And what we've seen during this pandemic was that being able to kind of open and close borders was one of the powers which governments and kind of bigger size European level conversations needed to focus on. And so sort of getting those controls in place for the next time we're facing those sort of situations does seem to be important. Yeah, so I think there's also a kind of a sense that we handle this as Europeans, because you know, there was clearly this idea that there is a limit to kind of where Europe stops in this idea of borders. But I think there's a lot more to dig into in terms of what that kind of means in the policy response.
And in this sense, I mean, this is kind of going back to one of the questions I think all of you were raising, that were raised in the discussion. I mean, yes, certainly these are questions that were made very evident, very visible by the pandemic moment, but were certainly there before. So thinking of the space of economic sovereignty and whether we imagine that to be national or European, or to what extent we imagine that to be national or European. And certainly, you know, to go back to your points, Cass, there are differences of opinion, not just regarding economic risk sharing, but certainly questions of governance and questions of sovereignty and where kind of the locus of decision making should lie. Now added to that, you know, kind of the governance of insecurity, whether economic, but, you know, migratory, the governance of flows, but also, you know, kind of really almost biopolitical, actually directly biopolitical. So I wonder, you know, how this sense will also change dynamics and perhaps will make some countries rethink their positioning within the European project and, you know, transforming it perhaps, but I guess, you know, it's still very much up in there in what direction. So I'm looking virtually at you, Cass. I don't know if you want to add to that, kind of thinking from, you know, some of the comments that you left us with.
I think that the concept of sovereignty, I find personally a difficult one. In a world which is incredibly interconnected, absolute sovereignty doesn't exist. So it's not only of the discussion of where you put your sovereignty. It's also, sorry, it's a difficult word still. It's also a matter of to what extent do you want to exert that sovereignty? I think that you see that very clearly developing in the discussion on strategic autonomy, where we do feel, and I think the majority of the member states, that the open economy has made us vulnerable against certain practices, and we're looking to reduce the vulnerabilities. At the same time, there is, of course, an incredible amount of wealth generated by having that open economy, and perhaps also an incredible amount of stability generated by having that very open, interconnected economy. So the concept of sovereignty then doesn't really fit there anymore. What you want to do is maintain the benefits and minimize the negative aspect. So your remark of managing vulnerabilities, of governing vulnerabilities, is something I find very interesting, which I haven't thought about at all, and I should be start to think about that as well. I think there is to manage vulnerabilities well, the European level and the national level, and perhaps even lower levels of government, have to cooperate very well and have to basically make sure that they cooperate very well. And how we do that, that's another question, I think.
Well, and I guess, you know, kind of thinking back to the more Europe argument, I mean, those forms of cooperation, I think, you know, are absolutely necessary. I mean, and this, you know, this goes beyond to what more Europe can mean, that it's not just, you know, more powers to the Commission. But I think it's also going to be, and already is, I mean, a very important political question for European citizens. I mean, what are you willing to render to the different, you know, levels of government, levels of governance in terms of, you know, your own kind of autonomy and think about the locus, the appropriate locus of decision making in managing these various vulnerabilities, threats, insecurities. And, you know, again, I wonder what we will be left with after the crisis moment has passed. And I think that's why it's really interesting that we keep coming back, you know, to this question. I mean, are we having this discussion right now only because we were thrust into a crisis situation? I mean, crises can be productive, but they're also very problematic because they make possible forms of intervention, which are, you know, very often emergency forms of intervention, often without democratic oversight or minimal, you know, kind of democratic oversight. And, you know, there's a whole kind of set of questions there. So I don't know if we want to necessarily extend crisis modes of governance into the future, far from it. But perhaps, you know, kind of think about, you know, how to proceed from there. I don't know, Teresa, you were shaking your head, so I don't know if you want to jump in.
No, not shaking. No. I think it's it's definitely an interesting question. I mean, first of all, when will there be no crisis? I think, people who kind of grew up, who are a bit younger than us, they just know the EU in crisis, basically, because this is, I also remember that my first course on the EU was somewhere in the early 2000s, and it was labeled EU in crisis. And this was then the constitutional crisis. So, which in hindsight looks so, was this really a crisis?
I thought those were the good times looking back.
So I get almost a bit nostalgic to that because it was, easily or not really as fundamental as the crises that we're currently seeing here. But I do definitely think that this crisis mode is quite important for the EU, and that because of the string of crises that we have seen, the way people think about the EU, about European integration and the benefits of it have definitely changed. And one of my co-authors, actually, Francesco Nicoli, he has done some very interesting research on how, for example, the Euro crisis has actually already impacted public support. So, so I think whether we come back to a normal, to the EU as we know it, I'm not so sure at the moment. But I think that these moments will all forge European integration and also EU support in fundamental ways.
Well, I think on that note, also looking at one of the comments in the questions that, asks precisely is, does the EU kind of proceed through crisis? Is European governance very much increasingly being conceived through crisis? I think this would be a good way to close, but I'd like to, I guess, throw in there, crises can also be, as we said before, productive. And the great French philosopher Edgar Morin has this wonderful kind of notion of the tourbillon, the Euro-generating, kind of whirlpool or crisis, which according to him has been a kind of a Euro-generating force since historical times. So let's see what comes out of this whirlpool also at the end of this week. Thank you so much for being with us and for sharing the results of your research. Thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you, Cass, for your challenging questions and for pushing us to take, to take this discussion further. We will have a recording of this event available very soon, I think in about 48 hours, so you can share it with your colleagues. But thanks once more to our 3 presenters, and we look forward to seeing you at another ACES event. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for a great discussion. Bye-bye.